Okay, where to start? Let me start with this question of the uniqueness of the U.S. that Abby raised. The argument is that there have been empires throughout history, and what is unique about the U.S. is that it moves towards being a specifically capitalist empire, in the same way that there's always been exploitation, but exploitation under capitalism takes a specific form. It has the appearance of being voluntary in terms of the volunteer labor. So this is a historical process. I don't want to exaggerate it. There are all kinds of exceptions to it. But I think what is interesting about the U.S. is that after the war, the U.S. actually sets an agenda of getting rid of empires, of moving away from empires. The U.S. agenda is not to become another empire like Britain or France or Portugal or Spain. It's actually to move towards a global world in which capitalist social relations dominate, and to move away from a world that's divided into spheres of influence. And so its relationship to, what's so significant about its relationship to Britain and the developed capitalist countries is that it quite successfully integrates them into this global project and pressures them to start moving away. It's complicated, it's uneven, but to move away from empires. Then it's confronting this question that David raised, this really complex question of what happens in the South. How do you integrate the South into global capitalism when it has a history of colonialism? It doesn't have the kind of institutions that the capitalist countries have. So all of this makes it very complicated. And what's interesting about this period is that when you're looking at the 70s, through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you're still seeing all kinds of liberation movements emerging, all kinds of movements trying to nationalize, and not just liberation movements, but socialist movements. What's remarkable about the present period is how few states, countries, are trying to leave capitalism. That in this present period, you've actually integrated most of Asia, you've integrated the communist countries, you've integrated China, you've integrated Eastern Europe, and even amongst the BRICS, there's nobody's talking about leaving capitalism. The liberation movements that were there in the 60s and 70s are quite limited. You have those kinds of discussions still taking place in a few places in Latin America. But generally, in most of the world, overwhelmingly, they're not taking place. And in the US, you still got the legacy of colonialism, but the form in which the US expresses its domination is increasingly, and quite generally, in Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, through sovereign states, through markets, through pressures for neoliberalism as a form of integration in these countries. So that's the kind of sense that I'm trying to see this as. We have to think about empire itself as a concept, as developing historically, and that it changes its form as capitalism develops. And that's an uneven process. I mean, it didn't just kind of emerge from nowhere, so it's still dealing with colonialism. But that's been the strength of the American empire, that it's been able to be a different kind of an empire in that sense, that can actually present itself in a lot of ways as being anti-imperialist. But the name of the game is that you will enter capitalism and open yourself up to capitalism. On the question of ecology, David may want to talk more about this because he's written about catastrophism. So I'll just give my position on it. And I don't consider myself much of an expert on ecology. I think it's a mistake to tell people that because of the environment, the world will collapse in 10 years unless we have a revolution. Because people know we're not going to be strong enough in 10 years to change capitalism and have a revolution. So that's just another argument for saying that you might as well give up and the world is going to fall apart. I think you have to be really careful with that argument. I think what is so important about ecology is that this is going to be the new inequality of the future, in addition to the inequality of income and wealth distribution and development. The ecology and distribution of rights to air and water is obviously going to be a major international issue. On the question of internationalism, I mean, this is really difficult, but my take on it is that, you know, if you're on the left, then your sense of social justice is always universal and it's always international. This is just kind of goes with the territory. You have a sensibility to internationalism, international solidarity. But the reality is that there's not much we can do about internationalism if we can't get our shit together domestically. If we have a working class that can't defend itself domestically, if we can't get unity across unemployed workers and across non-union workers, across precarious workers, across gender and race, across steel workers and auto workers domestically, we're not going to be able to do much internationally. So the question of actually being effective internationally depends on building a movement here that can stir up shit here, that actually creates space for others because you're fighting here. Because when we're not fighting here, we're just making it so much harder for anybody to fight elsewhere. So of course, when something comes up, you show your international solidarity in terms of Palestine or Afghanistan or Iraq. But I think our politics has to begin at home with that kind of international sensibility. The question of free trade. To me, the question is capitalism, not free trade. I guess I'm less interested in arguing about whether the next free trade agreement is going to make things a little bit better or worse, because even if it made things better, what it's about is constructing a world where capitalism is free and that has a constitution for corporations in terms of freedom is defined in their terms. Free trade, free mobility of capital. And it seems to me that's what we're fighting. We're fighting against that kind of freedom. We're trying to put a different kind of democracy on the agenda. And I think we have to go beyond taking a look at, okay, they've got all this free trade now, what's the next free trade agreement on the agenda? And actually being able to talk about capitalism as a social system that denies human potentials even when it's working well. That's very difficult to do, but I think we have to be able to talk about it. Technology, I think, my quick answer is just dialectical, Steve. No, I don't see technology as an independent variable. It obviously has a certain amount of autonomy. Technologies develop not just because you're being instrumental, but yeah, you can't understand technology without understanding capitalism. I want to make one point about technology, and it relates to the environment. That's the thing I'd like to make. Capitalism is lousy, and then I'll stop there because I'm going on. Capitalism is lousy at doing basic research, actually, because it can't capture it by each corporation. So this is a problem for the American capital and the American state that wants to keep moving into the highest tech sectors. The question is, how do you do that when individual corporations aren't interested in doing the basic research? And the way that's evolved in terms of technological advance has been to do it through the Department of State, the Defense Department, the Department of Health, the Department of Agriculture. It is phenomenal what has come out of these state institutions in terms of technological development. You know, you can do anything from cell phones, you know, computers, the aerospace industry, lasers. And right now, the most research being done on the planet in regards to the environment is in the Department of Defense. Because they have to figure out how to get energy to where it's needed. The cost of energy isn't just what a cost of a barrel is, it's the cost of all the security and all the transportation costs of getting it to where you have to get it, and the army of defending that energy. And the Department of State is doing this for its own reasons, as an institution within the state. It's not doing it to solve a general environmental crisis, but it's got to deal with an environmental problem. But because the American capital has this capacity to commercialize things, whenever these things happen and these kinds of research gets done, they've had a capacity to actually commercialize it and marketize it. So I don't think you can understand the question of technology. I don't think you can reduce it to a functional notion of what capital needs, but I don't think you can understand it without introducing the state and then that kind of dialectical relationship between how basic research gets done and how it gets commercialized.
Great, thank you so much.
I wanted to come back to race, but I'll wait. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm not going to take the questions necessarily in the order in which they came, just more or less in the order in which I'm thinking about them now as I was reflecting on what Sam was saying. So I'll just take the technology question and the ecology one. It may sound too simple, but I do think that you can capture the basic structure of technology and technological developments in capitalism on two axes. One is technologies to increase the speed of the labor process, to increase the rate of exploitation by speeding up human labor. And secondly, the development of technology to colonize and commodify more and more aspects of everyday life, particularly life away from work. In other words, you move into a society in which not only, just like capital tries to speed us up so that if the human body is in motion 57 seconds out of every minute, you try to figure out how to get the 58th second. And by the way, the studies show that's exactly what they're doing. But also that when working classes first developed within capitalism, they spent most of the time out of the workplace, not interacting all the time with commodities. Okay? There were all kinds of social recreational activities which were very separate. There weren't yet mass consumer markets and so on and so forth. The more that capital can colonize all of those spheres of social and recreational life, then that just, creation of huge commodity markets. And so I think for me, those are the two key dimensions. And that takes us to Sam's point on ecology, which I won't do any justice. I will simply say this, that I think those analyses which have picked up on Marx's idea that capitalism creates a metabolic rift between humans and the natural world is absolutely crucial, incredibly important, and it gives us some theoretical bases for developing a radical Marxian eco-socialism. And so I think those insights are incredibly important. As a result, I think it's correct to say that capitalism unleashes a kind of destructiveness towards the natural environment that imperils life of species generally. But I think, and this connects to one of the points that Sam was making earlier, I think that capital approaches this as an opportunity as well. In other words, they are looking all the time at how to technologize ostensible solutions, whether it's carbon trading or green products that are designed to, in fact, profit from the very crisis that capital has created. And I think it's naive not to recognize how much discussion is happening in all kinds of corporate sectors right now about how they can produce commodity responses, in other words, purely capitalist type responses to the very ecological crisis they've created. The final point I would make around it is, like Sam, I don't think you win people to the socialist left by saying we have 5 years, or, I got one email recently that said we had 2 weeks to save the planet. If they were right, I figured I may as well just party for 2 weeks, because, I don't think, never mind 10 years, this is like some telescope time scale. But I think that what that misses, the kind of catastrophic speculations from the left. It misses the concrete opportunities that actual struggles around specific ecological and environmental problems can raise. Whether it's from the water wars in Cochabamba in the year 2000, where here you have a key environmental question, which is non-commodification of water, which becomes the start of the cycle of revolt in Bolivia. Or the struggle over Line 9 in Toronto today, for instance, or all kinds of struggles that are happening in racialized working class communities over what can only be described as environmental racism. I mean, where is the junk being dumped, for instance? It's usually in poor racialized working class communities, both at home and abroad. And clearly, over and over again, we're seeing environmental questions get raised by key indigenous struggles happening, and the struggle with the Mi'kmaq right now in New Brunswick is part of that pattern. So I think the key thing in terms of left responses is to identify actual sites of struggle around which we can mobilize and then do the work of talking about why the system does this, rather than in a sense of just try to scare people that if you don't do something, the whole planet's going to die. Okay, last two points on the EU trade deal. You see, I think rather than trying to analyze what it's going to do to different sectors of the economy, it's way more important to step back and go, why is capital so crazy for these deals? Why are they so addicted to them and pushing them? And I think the key answer is that what they allow capital to do is to integrate labor markets in such a way as to create a new lowest common denominator. In other words, you bring Mexico into an agreement with Canada and the United States, and all of a sudden Mexican labor standards, wages, and so on become the benchmark. You get a deal involving the EU, and by the way, what is the one thing that the EU Commission recently said had been successful about austerity? They agree that it hasn't actually created jobs, duh. But what has it been successful at? Cheapening labor costs. Yeah. Okay? And right now, Europe is, particularly Greece, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and so on, are ahead of the curve in devaluing labor power, in cheapening the cost of labor, in driving wages down and reducing the social wage. And I think we need to really always have that class critique at the forefront. And then finally, Abby's point, which was great, but way too big for me to do justice to, and I'm going to make a confession. I have not yet read Vivek Chibber's book. It is on my pile, but Sam and Leo wrote a really long one, and I'm only like about a third of the way through it so far, and my intention was to read it in the summer.
I'm halfway through.
You're halfway through. Okay. Anyways, I'm going to get through it in the next week or so, but. I do know something about the debate, but the general tenor of what you said I subscribe to, which is this, that it's not necessarily helpful, and I can't accuse Vivek Chibber or anyone of this having not read the book, but it's not helpful for people on the Marxist left simply to say, for instance, well, you've dropped out class, therefore I don't take you seriously, when in fact many of the responses that have come in feminist and post-colonial quarters have come because it looked like Marxists weren't serious about gender and racial oppression, about colonialism and anti-colonialism. And I think it's our task then to respond in a way which says, let's see what insights you've developed, even if ultimately we think that the theoretical and political framing is not adequate. In other words, it's the idea of an engagement which allows us to enter into a dialogue to push the work ahead, rather than just creating this, class movements debate. Working classes are movements. I would argue there's no such thing as a working class movement which isn't also a movement of women workers, of workers of color, and so on, even if sometimes the politics at the top have been somewhat oblivious to those realities. So yeah, I guess I'm kind of calling for constructive engagement, which doesn't mean that when people say objectively silly things, and by the way, you know, I think some of us Marxists have sometimes done exactly that, you don't say it, but that you recognize that very often the socialist left has had a credibility gap in terms of its commitments on anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, anti-racism, feminism, and so on. And we've got to acknowledge that comes from somewhere. And then, as I say, engage those forces that have been trying to address it, even if we think that ultimately there are better, deeper, more profound kinds of analyses that can be developed.
On ecology, and I liked very much David raising the relationship between labor and nature. You know, if you're going to produce things, you have to have labor and you have to have nature. And the point about capitalism is the particular way that it commodifies both and exploits them both, and that raises a question of them not being external. You have to integrate them into analysis. I think crucial to addressing the question of ecology is to not just talk about ecology. I think that if we can't defend the public sector against the notion that what's good for capital is what's good, then we can't win the ecology fight. So I think the ecology fight has to be integrated into the fight around the public sector. I don't think we can win the ecology fight unless we're talking about inequality and the redistribution. Because, you know, we can't say that the third world can have the same kind of pattern of consumption that we have, and we're going to continue to grow consumption and then think that this is possible. There has to be a redistribution, for one thing, between the rich and the poor inside domestic countries, but also internationally. And there has to be a cultural change. I mean, if we define success for the working class in terms of increasing material consumption indefinitely, rather than talking about different kinds of consumption, public consumption, why isn't long-term health care more important than a new toothpaste? If we're not going to talk about a cultural change, we also can't deal with the public sector. And if we don't start talking about conversion, and by conversion I mean a defensive battle. Oh, I do want to get to the co-op thing as part of that. You know, when the auto industry was in crisis, hundreds of plants were closed. And the question was, why did we just let those things close? Those are all things that, you know, could have produced useful things. And if we take the environment seriously as the issue of the next century, then we could have started talking about converting them and the skills that the workers had to doing environmentally useful things. And as soon as you do that, you just start a different discussion. You have to start talking about planning. You have to start talking about democratic planning. You have to talk about production for use, not for profit. You have to talk about solidarity, not competition, etc. So I think there's a whole potential by putting ecology into a much larger framework. On the question of American power, the question isn't whether America is omnipotent. America cannot do what it wants. It's not omnipotent. The point is that it's structuring a particular world, and it's been able to integrate people and states to an amazing degree into that world. And what we have to understand when we're evaluating American success, so, you know, in 1950, America has half of the world's production. By the mid-70s, it has a quarter. It wasn't weaker by the mid-70s, because the American project is about spreading capitalism. This is what its project is. It's about the making of a global capitalism. It's about integrating other capitalists in that process, and therefore it's not weakening it. It's stronger coming out of the 70s. So when you look at a country like Brazil, what you see is Brazil protests America for not opening up its borders on free trade and letting its sugar in. Well, what is it saying? It's saying we want to be part of global capitalism. It's saying that the model we want for food production isn't that we should feed our own people within Brazil, as the landless movement has argued, but that we want to cater to multinationals inside Brazil. The fact that the Brazilian multinationals doesn't matter much, so that they can export. They can have an export-oriented model. So what you end up with Brazil is that when people talk about Brazil today being a sub-imperial power, because Brazilian multinationals are expanding. What they're really talking about is the development of capitalism. And that isn't a threat to the United States. No one is blocking American capital from coming into Asia. You know, they'd rather have sub-regional free trade agreements if they can't get something else. Of course, they'd rather have an overall free trade agreement, and in some cases, they see these as steps towards overall free trade agreements. But what's happening in Latin America isn't threatening the United States. They're not trying to get out of capitalism. That's America's concern. They're not trying to block finance. They're not trying to block multinational. They're not trying to actually block free trade. This is what America is trying to build. It's trying to build capitalism. That's the concept. That's the whole that David was talking about. And the concept of empire is critical to that, because capitalism otherwise is just an abstract thing. Empire is what gives it material existence. So, and I think that's starting to be recognized by people in Brazil itself. That Brazilian capital and the Brazilian states aren't representing a challenge to that system. It's part of the integration. On the question of co-ops, I just want to answer quickly, because I think it's very important in terms of alternatives. The trouble with, and I just spent some time in Argentina going to some of the co-ops and talking to workers. I mean, the first problem is that what workers are taking over in most parts of the world, Madrigan is a bit of an exception, has been things that capital doesn't want. Well, this isn't the way of building an alternative. You don't take over the things that have failed and think you're going to build an alternative. You're almost going to prove your lack of capacity and why you need capital. That's one problem with it. The second problem is that you're not going to change the world if, after you take it over, you just have to fit into a competitive environment in the way that you describe and do those things to survive. Well, that's not an alternative. You're just competing with them too. And the third thing is that where you do take over something, because you have no choice, I would support it. You know, if you have no choice and they're closing your plant and all you can do is take it over, we'll take it over and see what happens. But you have to simultaneously be fighting for the state to give you some kind of support. Not just training, but actually buying the product. You know, if workers are taking over a place that makes hospital equipment, they should be buying it from that plant. So there should be some plan. You have to bring up the larger questions of socialism, so there's some plan that makes it possible for this to work. I just want to say something about neoliberalism, and I think David was hinting at it, and I think it's very important. We think of neoliberalism as in opposition to Keynesianism. We used to have a decent capitalism, now we have a rotten one. What we have to recognize is that neoliberalism began under Keynesianism. It was in the 50s and 60s that we had the expansion of free trade, the explosion of MNCs, and the explosion of finance, and not just the euro market. It was workers' mortgages and workers' pensions were the basis for financial power. So the beginnings of neoliberalism start then. And the most important thing that happened after the war was that to have the American empire, you had to contain American labor. And you had to marginalize the left. And the way you contained American labor was to promise it that you could give them what socialism offered in a safer way by redefining it as, we're going to treat you as workers, you just sell your labor, that's all you do, don't worry about anything else, and we'll give you private consumption. And the welfare state didn't challenge that, it supplemented it. So it was this major defeat of the working class right after the war, of a section of the working class, not of the working class, a section of the working class, the left, that created the basis for neoliberalism later. And you know, the implication of that is we don't have something good to go back to. You know, even just going back, given everything that's happened right now, would be so complicated. A final thing I just want to raise, I mean, we should save it for another thing, but I'm really struggling with this question of race and class, because I was just at a conference that was most black workers and some white workers. And I mean, in the US, you can't just define the problem as race. There's a distinct problem of black workers that is different from any other workers. You know, when you look at Asian workers, for example, the median wage of Asian workers in the United States is higher than white workers. So how do you understand that? Because if you don't understand that, it makes the black workers look like, well, what's wrong with them if Asian workers can do this? So you have to answer that. And the only way to answer that question is actually in class terms. The reason that Asian workers' wages are higher is because immigration laws were changed in the mid-60s that were biased towards bringing the middle class in. And some of those people came in and their standards were met, but a lot of them came in and they couldn't get their standards recognized. So they ended up doing the shit work as taxi drivers, as maids, etc. But they were coming with a middle class culture, and they transferred that to their kids. And that became part of why you've had a different result for, you know, the Asian working class. So when you're looking at race, you have to distinguish between that, and you have to distinguish between the history of blacks, and you have to distinguish between both of those, and the history of imperialism in Latin America, and the kind of immigration that came there. But that's a larger question that I'd really like to hear more about at some point.
Great. Thanks, David.
Okay, I'll try to be as brief as I can. Starting, I think, with Michael's question around co-ops and so on. In many ways, I still think that what Marx said around the workers' co-ops of his era is largely right, which is to say, he said, listen, the importance of workers' cooperatives is that they demonstrate that workers have the capacity to run production. This is an important kind of educative thing for the working class movement, just in terms of building that, to use a term that Sam often uses, to build those capacities. But, and the but was hugely important, he said, so long, and this is building on Sam's point, so long as they operate in a competitive market framework, they are going to have to obey the dictates of market production, which is they're going to have to meet the same levels of productivity and efficiency and pricing and so on. And as a result, they will internalize the logic of capitalism. And so you get, for instance, the phenomenon of co-ops that lay off some of their own members, for instance, to stay alive in the market, or cut their own wages to stay alive, or outsource in the case of Mondragon, which is a reminder that as important as experiments, for example, the ones that Sam was talking about, the wave of worker occupations beginning in 2000, 2001 in Argentina, the worker recovered enterprise movement, was for signaling a different direction of response to the crisis, that you can't generate simply local solutions, and you're going to have to be able to tie them to a project of a much wider social transformation. On the issue of capitalism and racism, again, I'm not going to do any justice to it here. I would simply make these points about it. When Marx says in that part 8 of volume 1 of Capital that capital comes into the world dripping in blood and dirt, he is talking explicitly about colonialism, what he calls the extirpation of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and he's talking about the Atlantic slave trade. And he names each and every one of these. And what he doesn't get to is the obvious next step, which is to say that if capital emerges in this way, it is going to produce a set of ideological, cultural, and social practices that are designed to both entrench and justify these sets of inequalities. And racism is absolutely central to that. I still think, even though it became much maligned in some quarters for a period of time, that Eric Williams' book, Capitalism and Slavery, is still incredibly important in understanding these processes by which capitalism comes into being in and through slavery and colonialism. But then we need the additional challenge of coming to terms with why so many white workers become invested in the practices of racism. And I think that David Roediger picks up on Du Bois, to quote him again, his insight that there are wages of whiteness, what he calls a public and psychological wage, in a society that grinds. All I was really trying to, the point I was trying to make from Du Bois and Rudiger's book is that the idea of the wages of whiteness as something to which large numbers of white workers invest is a really key part of analyzing the endurance of racism within working classes and among white workers. That was really all the point I was trying to make there. Finally, I want to come to Todd's last set of comments, because I think there's a tendency for us sometimes to flatten out, and I don't mean Todd, I mean people on the left too often, to flatten out the complex social struggles that come together and converge in any genuinely revolutionary movement within society. And a tendency very often for some of us on the left to talk as if only the workplace-based struggles are the story. And in fact, what we see across history, including the example of 1917 and the Russian Revolution, bread, peace, and land is not just about the workplace-based struggles. It has a particular class component, which is all power to the councils, as a solution to those complex struggles over bread, peace, and land. And I think it's right to say that many of the key radicalizing struggles of our moment have been around issues like land and water in particular. Sometimes it's the defense of key public goods. I mean, the Chicago teachers' strike is inseparable from a community-wide mobilization in defense of public education and against charter schools, and in particular, in terms of preserving schools in especially African American communities, which were slated overwhelmingly for closure. So it is simultaneously a union struggle, a struggle in defense of a public good, and an anti-racist struggle. And I think those convergences is what happens in all true great mass political and revolutionary upheavals. And I think it's really instructive, the example I used from Cochabamba earlier, where you get a mass uprising over the question of water, but in which a key trade union group, whose leader was Oscar Oliveira, which recognized early on that, as they put it, the world of work had changed. That they were factory workers, and they recognized that neoliberalism had destroyed the tin miners union. It had led to a proliferation of small workplaces. The average workplace in Cochabamba at the time of the uprising had 4 workers in it. And so they went to a different model of union organizing, where they set up a storefront and they mass leafleted in the city square, particularly around bus routes and so on, so that they could reach what they called the new world of informal work. They had laid, in other words, out a different kind of way of reaching out to the working class of the neoliberal era. And they didn't stay stuck in a model that had worked in the previous period. So it was a much more community-oriented form of working class organizing. And, of course, once they start to build the struggle, they create what we would call a broad coalition structure, known as the coordination, that becomes the framework for workers unorganized and organized, unemployed and employed, and so on, to gather and to converge. And I think we need to remember that there have been many labor and working class movements which weren't based on the notion that you had to be an employed worker in a particular site to have membership in the union. That unemployed workers, transient workers, and so on could all be part of working class and labor structures and movements. And I think particularly that speaks to the complexity of this situation in which you have land and water struggles, but in the case of Cochabamba, organized workers who actually established a whole new organizing model, played a central organizing role in a much broader kind of movement. And I think there's a wonderful phrase that Jeffrey Weber uses in his book on the Bolivian uprising, Red October, where he talks about combined oppositional consciousness. And he basically says it was class, indigenous, feminist, environmental, all in one. It wasn't a single identity. It was a combined oppositional consciousness which drew upon the old Marxist traditions of the tin miners on the one hand and indigenous communal traditions on the other, in a kind of synthesis that shaped a whole pattern of struggle. And I think thinking in those terms as a way of thinking about how a variety of sites of social struggle can still converge into a combined, unified movement, as it did in Cochabamba, is maybe one way of thinking about what the complex dynamics of class and social struggle could mean in this period of global capitalism.
Chicago teachers. Because we should also be aware of the limits of that struggle. It's absolutely wonderful, it's inspiring, it's fantastic in so many ways, but what they did was they engaged in a struggle around collective bargaining and thought about it in class terms and used the community. As soon as that struggle was over, they closed 50 schools. And all the teachers could mobilize. Yeah, all they could do was have a demonstration, and the demonstration happened and it closed. And that raises the question about, well, how could you fight those kinds of battles? And I think what would have been necessary would have been to identify schools as a public space, especially in poor communities, that is a health clinic, that is adult education, that is childcare, that is a space where you can come and fix your furniture, etc., and mobilize around it that way. That means something that you do outside of collective bargaining completely, and then actually occupy some schools, as an example, and under the assumption that other people will do it. I don't know how else you could do that. But to do those kinds of things, we have to recognize that they haven't had the support of their own union. This has been an isolated example of Chicago teachers. They're fighting with the American Federation of Teachers. They actually haven't had much support from the labor movement in Chicago. I mean, we should just be conscious of that. And to get that kind of support, to build a kind of movement that could think beyond bargaining, that could think about unifying labor, you have to have some political organizations. This isn't just a question of getting some struggles spontaneously happening and then they'll add up to something more. This is, I think, a key historical lesson, that there are things going on. People will always resist, they'll always fight back. The question is, do they add up to something? And that's the real dilemma we have. That's why we're in a crisis as a left, because they haven't been adding up to more than the sum of the parts, which is where I think David started with.
Great. And as we're folding up chairs, maybe people can make announcements and yell them out as we're folding.
Next coffee shop is Socialism and Feminism here, November 16th in 4 weeks.
November 16th in 4 weeks. Great.
Most of you would have signed it, but there is a petition to raise the minimum dollars at the back.
Great. Petition at the back. Great.